family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of takethe12.org. That's takethe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on takethe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about step 3 and our first legacy of recovery. And I'm really honored to have as my special guest with us today, Mike M. Mike, please introduce yourself, tell our listeners where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little bit about how you got to AA.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mike M. I'm an alcoholic. I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. My home group is the Friday noon dictator meeting at the Alco House. And my sobriety date is December 3rd, 1992.
And how you got to AA?
Yes. I got to AA because on the backside of a DUI, the person I was with at the time said I needed to go to AA, and I politely told her that I was not an alcoholic. She asked me if I would see a psychiatrist, and I was willing to admit I was crazy, but not that I was a drunk. And then the caveat to seeing the psychiatrist was she told me I needed to go to a 12-step program.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So jumping into this, I'm going to read a couple of things just to set us up since we're here to talk about step 3 today. And I always like to read from the foreword of the 12 and 12. And it says this: AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in their nature, which if practiced as a way of life, can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. And one of the reasons that I love reading that is because I think it is one of the best descriptions of what our 12 steps are, right? And Bill just succinctly wrote that in a way that helps us understand that there are a group of principles, and they're spiritual principles, which if practiced as a way of life, not just when it's convenient, not just every now and then, not just at meeting time, but as a way of life, several things can happen. That the obsession to drink can be removed, and that two other things really important can happen. One, that the sufferer, can become happily whole, which is internal, and usefully whole, which is external. So I love that definition. Also want to read the actual step itself. So step 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand God. And as we all know, each of our steps have a spiritual principle attached to it. And I like to use the spiritual principle of faith. I think trust sometimes is also another good spiritual principle for this step, but faith and/or trust. And when I'm working with a newcomer and taking them through the steps, one of the things that I like to do is to synthesize down onto, if you don't remember anything else about this step, remember this. And this is what I like to teach them on step 3. Real action starts with a decision. So when you said yes to being a guest on this podcast, and I gave you the opportunity of what you wanted to speak on, why did you choose step 3?
Step 3 is to me, it's the gateway to happiness. It's an action. And for the longest time, I thought it was step 3 has little lasting effect unless followed at once. Well, that's great when I was a newcomer. What happened when I became an old timer? And I was still using step 3. And and how it works, it talks that some of these we balk. 3 was my balk. 3 and 11 were my balk. I could not get them. And I can tell you, for me, what happened is by not getting step 3, I got drunk. And that was after about 15 months of sobriety. And when I came back in, I kept the same sponsor, and he asked me, what did I know about step 3? And it is very clear in the book. It says, the first one is we got to stop playing God. And it occurred to me when I showed back up that my God, I was not capable of helping or playing God. He didn't need my help, and I could no longer play the role. And I think that was my transition finally into step 3. And it allowed me to go through the steps on the initial contact. That's what gave me the courage to do it.
So you said, and thank you for that. You said that 3 and 11 were your bulk, where you were kind of stopped dead in your tracks. What was it about step 3 that you rebelled against so much?
So it talks about in the hackles will come up when the mention of God in the book. It talks about that. The sum of my experiences, I didn't have enough guts to be an atheist, but the sum of my experiences were, I'm not sure there really was a God. And I based that on, my mom died when I was 13 years old from cirrhosis of the liver. When I asked her why she was dying, she says, because I drink. And I said, why don't you quit? She said, I can't. I didn't understand that. Went to a little lovely place over in Southeast Asia for a while and saw random acts of things that happened that I just couldn't reconcile. Why would God let these things happen? So by the time I showed up to Alcoholics Anonymous, skeptical would be an improvement. I was truly an agnostic.
Right.
Neither believed or disbelieved.
So when you found yourself in that place, do you remember if there was like one thing that happened that began the process of shifting that rebellion?
Oh, yeah. My first round of sobriety, I originally got sober. A friend of mine, Terry S., he and I had almost the same sobriety date in 91, July 91. And he stayed, I didn't. But I can remember going to my sponsor and saying, Chuck, I can't get this. And he'd say, you're fighting it. Well, I can't get this. You're fighting it. And I could never understand what it was. And on December 2nd of 92, I guess enough Jack Daniels gave me the understanding that was the breakthrough. That morning, December 3rd, was the breakthrough that I call my sobriety date. That was at one point in time, because the first time in my life, even all my year in Nam, all my time in the military, I never did foxhole prayers. That morning, I said, God, please help. And I heard a voice in the back of my head that says, you know what to do, dummy. Go to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I went that Thursday night, and that started my sobriety up till today. For someone like you who I love that you said you were too chicken to be an atheist, but was likely agnostic at the very minimum. Where does that kind of prayer come from? Desperation, right? Yeah, I had tried everything that I could, and everything I did failed miserably. And I finally got to that point where nothing else has worked. I must be willing to try this. Right. That was the one thing I had never really tried at all. I gave lip service, but that morning it was from my heart. God, please help. And then I let him do what he needed to do. So that old saying of contempt prior to investigation, was there ever any investigation in your life prior to coming to AA about God? Oh, absolutely. Had been throughout the 40 years prior, not quite 40. I went to church as a kid, met friends that had been reborn Christians that talked to me about the power of God, the military pastors that talked to me about the power of God, people in my life, but it was just, again, that skepticism of the way I grew up and what I saw, I couldn't reconcile those. And that led me to, I probably made decisions based on that because I didn't have any place to turn to
Right.
except alcohol.
Going back to something I said a moment ago about the spiritual principle of this step being faith and or trust, let's talk for a moment about prior to coming to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, even maybe as a child, as a young adult, in your early adult years, what did you have faith in? What did you trust?
Trusted very little and had faith in my own abilities.
Right.
What I thought they were. I think the worst thing that happens to some of us are parents. They're the best thing that happened. But when your parents teach you that you can do anything you want, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you will succeed, didn't work for me in the case of alcoholism.
Right.
But I had that faith that I could do anything. I see it now in younger people. They got the big red S and the blue cape, and they think they can do anything.
Right.
I tried that. It didn't work too well for me.
One of the obstacles, and it's one of the things I wanted to talk about today is, what are some of the obstacles in being able to practically apply or take this step in our lives today? One of the biggest obstacles that I so often hear other members of Alcoholics Anonymous share is the first three words of step 3, made a decision. We look at step 3 kind of in a totality. So when we hear it, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand God. Well, I hear the part of turning my will and my life over to whatever it is that I understand as God, the action of turning my will and my life over. But sometimes I forget that the foundation of this step is that somewhere along the line, I had to make a decision. I'm going to read a little excerpt from the step study on takethe12.org on step 3, because it really helped me kind of begin to wrap my arms around that. It says this: decisions are wonderful. Decision is defined as, quote, making up one's own mind, end quote. Decisions resolve conflicts. For many, the conflict over drinking and not wanting to drink made a third step decision relatively simple. We were happy to turn over our drinking problem to God as we understood God. However, for many of us, we were not so willing to turn other areas of our life over so readily, right? So in the beginning, once I really began to understand the full implication of step 3, that there was an action that was going to need to be taken, I was going to have to make a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. In the beginning, it was just the alcohol, right? But somewhere along the line, I had to be willing to turn all things, all of my life over to the care of God as I understood him. So what did that process of making that decision look like for you?
So in reality, I make hundreds of decisions a day, one way or another. Now, how many do I actually apply and put action to? And so I agree with the decision. I made that decision. I just couldn't pull the trigger for the rest of it,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Sure.
And I don't know why. I don't know what the resistance was. I don't know if it was fear. I don't know what it was. But again, like I said, it took, going back out and hitting that final bottom. And I guess maybe that's part of it. I think step 3 could be somewhat related to a bottom, in that when you get to the point of desperation, and it's the last avenue, the last door on the block, as they used to say, that might have been my last door on the block that I could enter into and find sobriety. Mm-hmm. But I had to put some action behind the decision. And I had never been able to do that before.
Well, and you're absolutely right. And what this, at least from my perspective, what this step does is it helps shift our mindset from thinking directly into action, right? It goes from, and I know our listeners can't see us, but I'm pointing to my head, to my feet, right? From my thinking to my action. It opens the door to conforming our will to that of our higher powers. Step three, and this is again directly from the step study. Step three is the first step that I believe, and there are others that think differently, but in my experience, it's the first step that requires real and continuous action. The first two steps focus on reflection and introspection. In step two, we learned to believe in a power greater than ourselves, and some call that faith. But in step three, it allows us the place to solidify and act on this newfound faith in ways that we never knew possible before coming to the rooms. And some people call that trust.
I think that in the beginning, when I came back in, I made that decision. And one of the things that Chuck was so good about, my sponsor, he said, what I want you to only focus on is having the courage to go through the balance of the steps honestly this time. Mm-hmm. Because I had done the steps with him. Quote, I was honest as I could be at the time, which was not really a real truth. And when I did the second time I went with him, I had the courage to be very transparent, very clear. And it's because I followed, that was the action. I made the decision. The action was just to move on with the steps. And so step three in the beginning looked differently than it does now, if that makes sense.
Sure it does. It requires us at some point to be willing to say, my way doesn't work. My way doesn't work. You kind of alluded to it earlier that at some point I had to stop playing God in my life, right? And I think that in our steps, at least it's been my experience that in our steps, there are things we get to surrender in each one of the steps. And in step three, I think that we get to surrender, or at least have a willingness to begin surrendering the person I was before taking these steps. I have to be willing to say, that person no longer works. And I also have to surrender my belief that I know better what is right for me than God does.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. 100%. Can I quote something from the big book?
Sure.
Okay, so on page 64, it says, though our decision was a vital, crucial step, it could have little permanent effect unless followed at once followed by a strenuous effort to face and be rid of the things in ourselves which had been blocking us. And the first time around, although my sponsor told me that passage, showed it to me, I went on not thinking the effect third step had on it. Yeah. The second time around, when I invited God in, I said, God, please let me be honest, let me be truthful, and let me not be afraid. And going through all those things, it was amazing how that happened. That started, and you talked about it earlier, and we'll talk about it later, that started the road to faith.
Right.
That was my entryway in. I did all of those things. The man sit there and listened to all the stuff that I had, including all the stuff I was never going to say in my, my fourth step, but it was the use of the third step that got me there. The ability to say, all right, God, I'm going to turn this over to you and I'm going to let you do with it. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to not muck it up.
Totally agree with that. I heard someone share in a meeting once about step three, that it's like when you take your car to a mechanic to have them fix or service it, right? You trust that they're going to be able to get it all tuned up and ready to give it back to you. They don't want to keep your car. They just want to get it in good working order so you can move on down the road. Making a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God is much the same thing, right?
Yeah.
I'm just handing my life over to a power greater than myself that seems to have worked for a lot of other people, right? Millions and millions of alcoholics before me that have found great result from taking this step and turning their will and their lives over to the care of God and trusting that God is going to do a much better job of their life than they have. I mean, even if it's blind faith, You know, I remember I heard someone say once, when this, I know we're talking about step three, but in the step two conversation, a sponsor asked a sponsee once, do you believe that I believe? And the sponsee responded, yes, I believe that you believe. Well, then that's enough. Let's move on. Let's move on. Let's not belabor this, because if you believe that I believe, then you can trust that there's a process at work here that's better than anything I can do or that we can do on our own power, right?
Yeah, and you know, Chuck went through all that with me, and for maybe constitutionally incapable of being honest with myself. I don't know, but I do know that uh, I just couldn't pull the trigger on three, and that's a tough place to be in when you're new in recovery. You sit in a meeting and you hear other people talk about how they've got this faith, how God's doing this for them, yedity, 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 and you sit there in that back corner going, I'm not getting those results.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing those things. I don't know how they got there because I can't figure out how to get there.
And likely we're asking ourselves the question, what's wrong with me?
Oh, yeah.
What's wrong with me that all of these other drunks are getting it, but I'm not getting it? What is wrong with me?
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely that one. And that was huge. And I know when I work with guys now about step three, what I try to share with them are some of the experiences I've had around step three and in things that have happened in my life. Why my faith is strong today. Why do I trust this infinite God whom I can't talk to? Oh, I could talk to. I don't always, I hear him, but not directly. He and I are not shaking hands and having Diet Cokes together, but I know he's there. How did that even happen? Why is that part of it? And so when I'm dealing with my new guys on step three, and I'm kind of like you, it's like, okay, it's not whether I believe or not or you believe. What I try to get them to is let's get through the process so you can find the path to believe. And I try to get them on it. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of the steps, I try to get them on a path where they can develop their own belief.
Right.
And let me be a light post.
It also says in our text that the spiritual life is not a theory, we must live it, right? I can't just let all of this live up in my head. This beautiful concept, this beautiful idea, I have got to figure out a way to put it into practical application. And I'll be very honest with you, when I don't know what to do, let's say specifically around how do I make this decision? How do I learn to have faith? How do I strengthen my faith? How do I learn to trust? Sometimes it really is just as simple as go help another alcoholic.
You know, that is one solution. I got a friend of mine. I got to digress a little bit. His name was Vietnam Dave up in Novato, California. And Dave had a saying he could not get anybody through the steps, but he was great with newcomers. But one of his favorite sayings was, and I didn't get this, be kind, be loving, do nothing. And it is so hard for some of us to not do nothing. And I find that today when I get out of the way and I sit down and I let events fold the way they're supposed to without my help, God works his miracles. And it took a long time to get there. To me, that's a true understanding or belief in step three. I made a decision to turn my will in my life. Oh, now let me back off and do nothing. That doesn't mean that I can say, God, you'll pay the rent for me and I don't have to earn money. No, it doesn't mean that. But it means that when I have these decisions and I want them on my time the way I want them, sometimes I have to sit and be quiet and let God do his magic. And the right answers will come as if our own house is in order. It's that in the literature. And I think that be kind, be loving, do nothing is also another important step or another important part of understanding step three.
And another important part of this personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism, right? I'm not the same man I was when I walked in. I have to have that change, right? I need to be allowing myself to become a different person than I was prior to coming into the rooms of alcoholism. You know, on that idea of personality change, it's been said that with that we thought faith said this: I'll take away the pain and discomfort. You know, if I just turn my will and my life over to the care of God, as I understand God, all of my pain and discomfort would be taken away. But what it really is saying to us is, I will sit with you in it. I'm here with you, and we can walk through this together. That's what I have found faith and trust, how it's manifested in my life today. You know, and I know that you have on many levels as well. You have had your share of ups and downs. You have had your share of challenges, and are specifically, without going into the details, you are walking through a very difficult challenge right now in your life. And so, how are you practicing or practically applying faith and trust in your life today?
I have a God. That's how. It took years and years and years to build up a faith in this God that I didn't understand. And it came about by seeing the results over the years of what God can do in that third step. And it didn't happen right away. It was years and years and years before I started to really build up that faith. And the things that are going on with me now, it irritates my wife, but it's in God's hands. It's not mine. It's in God's hands.
Right.
And December 8th, 9th or 10th, whatever day it was, they finally got me out of the hospital. I looked like I was going to die and not make it before Christmas. And when the hospice people come in now, they'll look at me like, "You're the patient?" Yeah, I'm the patient, because I'm in the business of living through God's help.
Right.
I have faith that God's got a plan for me. I also have enough sense finally to know that I don't know what that is. None of my business.
And what a relief that is on some level, right? That I just get to sit back and trust that God's got it. I may not always understand it. I may not always even like it, but at least I get and have gotten it through my head that God's got my back in all things.
Well, so the third step is I go back to the serenity prayer. God, grant me the strength to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Accept. It doesn't say like. God's granted me the ability to accept things through the third step prayer.
Right.
That I couldn't accept before. It doesn't say that I had to like them. Didn't have to say it was on my terms, my time. God's got a whole different clock than mine. Things will happen on his time and not mine.
I think no, go ahead.
Bill was smart enough in a lot of our texts, made direct amends wherever, for an example, where, not whenever, wherever. And he used a lot of reference in the book about these things will happen, but it's not going to be up to us. And I have faith, like you were talking about, that God will do what God needs to do.
Right.
And he'll do it in my life. He walks with me.
And I love that you shared that it is through seeing the results is what over time, or at least in my case, seeing the results is what over time has strengthened my faith. I like to call them, when I'm working with sponsees, I like to call them sober references. I am banking a whole bunch of sober references every time I see God work God's miracles in my life today. And through the consequences of whatever action I'm taking or whatever the circumstance is, I get to see beautiful results today. And I start banking those. I start adding them up so that over time, I can, like you said, I can look back and I can see, that's right. God does have it. God does have it.
I'm sorry. I don't know if Chuck ever told you this. We were talking one time and he said, we were on a discussion around the third step. And he said, my job is I can't get in your path. I'm not going to push you and I'm not going to pull you, But I can guarantee you, anytime you need me and reach out, I will be beside you. And he said, God's the same way.
That's right.
God's not going to pull you along. He's not going to push you along. But every time you reach out, God will be there. And the man did not tell me a lie. That's been my experience.
That's right. That's right. You talked a moment ago about prayer. And I want to kind of circle back over to one of the most beautiful prayers that we have in our literature, which is in fact the third step prayer. And I remember years and years and years ago, I had someone help me take a look at the third step prayer in a completely new way that I had never seen it before. And they allowed that new approach to the third step prayer by using one word throughout the prayer. And the one word was why. So have you ever wondered why in the third step prayer that we offer ourselves to thee? God, I offer myself to thee, right? The answer to the why is in the next sentence, so that our higher power can build with us and do with us as it will, right? Have you ever wondered why we ask God to relieve us of the bondage of self? Well, again, the answer is in the next sentence, so that we may better do God's will. And the same thing applies to the last part of it. Have you ever wondered why we ask HP to take away our difficulties? Again, found in the next sentence, so that we fully understand that victory over them may bear witness to those that we would help of God's power, God's love, and God's way of life. And I loved breaking it down like that, by just asking the simple question, why? Just to help me better understand why we go to God for these things. How has the third step prayer been a part of your life?
One of the things that I had it a second ago, and I'm gonna lose it out of my mind. You'll edit this one out. Knowing what God's will for me was. And I don't know what God's will for me is. What I do know is what is not God's will. Can I treat you a certain way in a meeting? Can I treat you with love, kindness, and fairness in a meeting? Can I go outside and do the same thing again? Is God's will going to be working in my life then? If I see someone in need, does the first question have to be, oh, are you an alcoholic? Oh, no, I can't help you. Instead, how can I help? How can I love? How can I get past my own prejudices, my own fears, all of these things, and I can't on my own? There was some I've been known to swear once or twice, and I would use the word GD often around a friend of mine, and he took exception to it. And my first reaction was, yeah, well, that's just your problem. Well, you know what? No. And it's surprising. I don't say, every once in a while it'll slip out. And when I do, I apologize to God for that. But that was not who I was a couple of years ago. See, so this still works, this faith, this letting God work in me. And it only comes from when I ask God the third step to build with me, so that victory over the things that I'm doing will bear witness.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes from faith, trust, willingness. I think willingness, and I didn't have that the first time around. And I think back on it. Willingness was the thing that, when I finally got really willing to let God come into my life, the third step prayer started to act in my life. It started to become a part of.
You talked about this a moment ago, but I want to circle back to something you were talking about when you take a sponsee through the steps. When you're taking a man through the steps, is there one specific thing you always want them to know about this step?
This step? Yes, that it's going to be a lifelong process. Step 3 is a lifelong deal. It's something I have to do on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes a minute-by-minute basis, depending on what's going on.
For sure.
But step three is always one of those, if I trust God, which is not my go-to. When a situation happens or something goes on, going to God is still not my first go-to. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to make it better. I'm going to do this, yedity, when it wasn't my business to do any of it. And I finally look at God and say, God, you're right. It's not mine. You've got it. Do what you need to do and help me get out of the way.
Which is a perfect lead in to the next question that I wanted to talk to you about, which is this idea of inventory. I'm a real big believer, as you know, I'm a big believer in this idea of inventory. And, there's a lot of people, a lot of members of Alcoholics Anonymous that don't do it on a regular basis, but I believe that taking inventory on a regular basis is vital to the maintenance of my spiritual condition. So that you can continue to turn your will and your life over to the care of God and make sure that God's in charge and you're not. What does inventory look like in your life today?
So my inventory is the 10th step prayer, or 10th step. In that, a friend of mine taught me that I had to go all the way back to step 3 every night. Invite God in. Write down those things that I did. Go to step 6, look for the character defects. Step 7, humbly ask him to remove them. I've got a list of persons I probably have harmed. Then I call my sponsor, supposedly, and say, hey, do I need to do this? And that's my 5th step. Okay? But a lot of it you can see right away. It's like, I can no longer use the excuse I don't need to make amends. If I made it that piece of paper, I owe somebody some amends.
Right.
But the process for the inventory was, when I look at it, it's not a spot check. It's actually a health check. What kind of health am I in? Emotionally, physically, the emotional sobriety. Do I have it or not?
Right.
And I think for me, the 10th step is that clarification process. And I look back even today and I can't think of any resentments I've got, which was not the case when I got here. Good Lord Almighty. I didn't have any when I got here until I started writing them down. It was amazing how many of them I had. When I do the 10th step and the way I do the 10th step, I don't find them anymore.
One of the best ways that I have found for me to be able to gauge just exactly how well I am controlling my life or trying to control my life is when I look at where I am through the inventory, through the Paggles: pride, anger, greed, gluttony, lust, envy, sloth, fear. Where am I? Where are all of those things manifesting in my life today? Because if they are, what that means is that I've taken back control. Oh, no, thank you, God. I got this. I'm going to handle it. And it's for me, it's one of the quickest ways to be able to do that.
Great. So I'm back to remember that anything, I think for me, anything that comes in my life, I believe God wants me to make an honest effort towards it.
Right.
It's knowing when to let it go and give it up to him. And I'm going to sooner or later, trust and believe.
Sure.
But the bottom line is that there's some footwork that I always need to do. And sometimes there's, do I need to pocket my pride, my ego? Am I being gluttonous or am I being slothful at this point in time? And I think today, and since you started me on that process, that filter now comes up and I recognize it much quicker than I used to.
Right.
So a lot of times I'm starting down that path and go, nope, don't need to be there.
Right.
I need to rethink this and I'll stop and make a lane change.
Right.
And I know too that with step 3, and one of the things I love about it, when I make the decision, I don't care what path's in front of me. I can go down any path. And if I get down the path where there's a brick wall, all I have to do is turn back around to where I started at and go down a different path.
Right.
And it didn't used to be that way. I would go and I wouldn't let God do it. God's given me a U-turn button. I can U-turn, go back to where I started, and go back down a different path.
And to be completely transparent with our listeners, you kind of alluded to it a moment ago. I have the honor and privilege of working with Mike today as his sponsor, and I've known him for years. But this sponsor-sponsee relationship is fairly new to each of us. As he has referred to in our episode today. You had been working with Chuck for how many years?
We were together 30 years, almost 31.
Almost 31 years. And I had the honor of being Chuck's sponsor for the last 2 years. I think it was about 2 years. And so that made Mike my grand sponsee. And when we lost Chuck, how long has it been now, Mike?
4 months.
4 months. We lost Chuck 4 months ago. Mike came to me and asked me if I'd start working with him. And one of the first things we did, and I felt it was really important, even though we both have long-term sobriety, was to, where are we in our relationship with God today? And one of the best ways for us to do that, and I have Mike doing this on a regular basis, is going through the Pagel inventory: pride, anger, greed, gluttony, lust, envy, sloth. And you have found great benefit from that.
Well, yeah. And it's amazing. There are some that don't envy. It's surprising I have no envy. I have never figured out when I don't. I celebrate other people's accomplishments.
Right.
I have pride today, but I also have the knowledge that it wasn't mine. That's God's.
Right.
See, all of these things, we talk about the third step in trust and faith. Everything that's happened in my life, everything that goes on in my life today is not a direct result of Mike. It's a direct result of where God wants Mike to be. And I think the hardest thing for me, and around third step, and also the 11 for that matter, but the hardest thing around the 11th, third step, was for me to let God do that and then understand it was going to be okay the way it was.
Right.
Get that acceptance, get that peace of mind, that serenity that comes. I love the passage in the how it works. It says, we are in the world to play the role he assigns. Third step. Just to the extent that we do as we think he would have us, not that we think what he's going to have us do, and humbly rely on him. Does he enable us to match calamity with serenity?
Right.
That third step is that get me out of my own chaos of my own creation and let me have some serenity.
Well, and I love that you shared that, because and you kind of started off with this, that it supports something in our literature that made me think of the part that talks about in step 2. In step 1, we identified we were powerless. In step 2, we came to believe in a new power, that there was a power out there that was greater than I am, that can restore me to sanity or soundness of mind. But in step 3, and it says this in our literature, a new power flows in. Once I have come to believe in that new power, through making the decision to turn my will and my life over, I get to allow that new power to flow into me, to your point, so that I can recognize that it's not coming from me. It is coming from a power greater than myself, right?
Yeah. I think that the key to the step for me is, at the end of the day, is don't fight it.
I love
Don't
it.
expect too much. As a matter of fact, don't have an expectation. Just let it be what it is supposed to be. And I can remember I wanted it so bad and I couldn't get it. And then I fought it and fought it and fought it. When I finally just gave up the ghost and said, all right, you do what you're going to do.
Right.
I quit. I'm not going to do it anymore. I think that was probably the true definition of surrender right there.
For sure, for sure. And I love it that you answered the last question that I was going to offer up before I even asked it, which was, is there anything else that you'd like to offer as a closing comment on this step? Something that you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put the spiritual principle into practical application in their lives? And you said, just don't fight it.
Yeah.
Just
get over the fear. There's no fear to be had there.
Yeah.
There's nothing, I know that I think part of this, and looking back over the years, the third step meant I had to do a fourth. I didn't care about the fourth step. Everybody heard my fourth step at every bar stool in town. But I was never going to tell one person, because you would judge me. And if you judge me, you wouldn't like me. So that went all the way back to the third step, that fear. And when I finally got past that fear It was honestly my fourth step and my fifth step. That's when all the great events started to happen.
That's
The
right.
book talks, find a closed mouth friend.
That's
Find
right.
someone that you can trust. And it doesn't come easy for men. I don't know about the ladies, but most of the men I've ever met, trust does not come easy. And Chuck put it to me the best I've ever heard. He says, I will never do your fifth step in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and you don't need to do mine.
Right.
What you say to me stays with me. What I say to God stays with God.
And how wonderful that we are in a position today through the third step to be able to experience a peace that we've never had before, that we can finally let go of the struggle.
We are children of chaos. And in my early sobriety, if there wasn't any going on, trust me, I was going to manufacture it. And today I've come to love serenity. I like the peace in my life. And that's only as a result of taking the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Absolutely. Mike, thank you so much for your time and for your service today. I'm confident that our listeners are going to be able to take away a lot from your sharing. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the honor of inviting me, Rick, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Absolutely. Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn more about all three of our legacies in AA through STEP, tradition, and concept studies, blog posts, videos, books, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this: we clearly see AA in three dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any one of these, AA couldn't function. God bless.